This is Atomic Biscuits, and I'm your host, BACFA. This story comes to us from RedState.com's Bonchi. Joe Biden shows up on The View to kneecap Harris, threaten Trump, and bask in delusion. In a bit of a surprise move, Joe Biden showed up on The View on Wednesday, sitting at the table with the intellectual heft of Whoopi Goldberg, Sonny Hostin, and Joy Behar surrounding him. The president managed to kneecap Kamala Harris, threaten Donald Trump, and bask in delusion during the segment. When asked about Harris, Biden did the one thing she can't afford for him to do. He hung the failures of his administration around her neck. Biden said, "As vice president, there wasn't a single thing that I did she couldn't do, and so I was able to delegate her responsibility on everything from foreign policy to domestic policy." Well, that's good to know, because Harris and her allies in the press have been doing their level best to paint the vice president as a powerless bystander who would have done things completely differently had she been in charge. Yet here's Biden saying he delegated responsibility to her on everything from foreign policy to domestic policy. The disaster in Afghanistan, she's responsible. The disaster at the border, that's on her as well. The exploding inflation and interest rates, Harris did that. I'm glad Biden was able to clear that up for us so we can stop pretending the vice president has no power. Of course, later in the interview, the topic turned to Donald Trump. At one point, Goldberg called the former president a bug, at which point Biden then imitated killing one on the table. Then Goldberg says, then he just wouldn't, like he was a bug. He just kept being there. He was like a bug right there, points at the table and makes a buzzing sound. Biden slaps the table as if he were killing a bug. The audience erupted in laughter, and the ladies at the table couldn't contain themselves. How hilarious, right? It's not like multiple people have tried to shoot and kill Trump over the last 2 months. Imagine if the former president had been a part of an exchange like this. The accusations of him inciting violence would never end. Naturally, Behar, who has all the self-awareness of a dead leaf, then complained that Trump has criticized Biden's rhetoric. That led to the president to double down on his wild claims that Trump is a threat to democracy and whatnot. He might as well be inviting someone else to take a shot. I won't transcribe it because it's nothing new. The same people who constantly demand the temperature in politics be lowered are the ones always turning the heat up. With that said, I promised delusion, and Biden brought that in spades. When asked about his dropping out of the presidential race, he insisted that he would still beat Trump if he were the nominee. Biden said, "I never fully believed the assertions that somehow there was this overwhelming reluctance of my running again. I didn't sense that, and all of the polling, they said Biden's polling was different. The fact of the matter was my polling was about where, always within the range of beating this guy. And, what I did was, I think it made sense. There were some folks who like to see me step aside so they have the chance to move on. I get that. That's just human nature. But that wasn't the reason that I stepped down. I stepped down because I started thinking about it." Farah says, "Do you think if you had stayed in the race, you would have won?" Biden says, "Yes, I was confident I would beat Trump. He's a loser." For context, Sonny Hostin compared Biden to George Washington during this show. So to get it all straight, Biden is the greatest president since the founding who has zero mental decline, and he would have beaten Trump, but he dropped out. Does that make sense to anyone else? That contradiction will never be explained by Democrats, and it's shameful the press has chosen not to ask any serious questions about this issue. This is simple. If Biden were as great as they say, and he's as mentally fit as they assure us he is, he'd still be in the race. Finally, I'll end things with a nod to the stupid argument over saying Kamala Harris's name. Democrats have repeatedly asserted that it's racist if you use anything but perfect pronunciation when addressing her. Yet here's Goldberg calling Harris Kamala. It's linked to several video clips here. Recall that Representative Nancy Mace was recently shouted down on CNN by Michael Eric Dyson and others over this. Later, Dyson had a meltdown when Mace then shared texts of him hitting on her following the exchange. Everything is so stupid. I think that about sums up Biden's interview on The View. Again, that's Bonchi, one of my favorites, over at redstate.com. We have this article, very brief. Nancy Pelosi shows her true colors when Jake Tapper dares air criticism of Kamala Harris. Why would you even cover that? Journalist does his job, and that makes Nancy Pelosi unhappy. Representative, former emeritus something or other, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, became outraged and lectured CNN anchor Jake Tapper on Tuesday for doing his job as a journalist. During an interview with the former House Speaker that focused on Vice President Kamala Harris's refusal to lay out substantive plans for America and her habit of dodging media interviews, Pelosi excused Harris, saying that she has no complaints about how Harris is going forward. But the interview became contentious about halfway through when Tapper brought attention to the issue of perceived cognitive problems among presidential candidates. Then Tapper played video of Donald Trump criticizing Harris's cognitive abilities. They laugh at us all over the world. They're laughing at us. And you know what they're really laughing at? Kamala, because they can't believe she's going to be president. They can't believe, Trump said in the video. You talk about cognitive problems. She's got bigger cognitive problems than he has, in my opinion. The fact that Tapper would dare legitimize Trump's critiques incensed Pelosi. Why would you even cover that? The California Democrat snapped. This is a person who's not on the level. He is the nominee for he's their nominee for president. He is incompetent, she continued. Let's not even talk about the silliness of it all and the weirdness of it all and the assault on women that it is. We're not going to talk issues. Incompetent. Pelosi then launched into a series of angry attacks on Trump. She claimed the only thing Trump did as president is to pass legislation that benefited America's richest citizens, which is not true. Claimed he had the worst job creation record of anybody president since Herbert Hoover, not true. And claimed he is responsible for thousands and thousands of people dying during the COVID-19 pandemic, also not true. Incompetent. Forget silly and crazy and crooked and all the rest. Incompetent, Pelosi raged. Tapper tried to correct Pelosi's falsehoods, reminding her that the job losses that happened in 2020 under Trump weren't because of him, but they happened because states shut down during COVID, and fortunately Tapper had the gumption to defend himself. Let me just say, why do I run that clip? I run that clip because that's the Republican presidential nominee, and I thought you might have a reaction to it. Explained. It is, after all, Jake Tapper's job as a journalist to cover what the leading presidential candidates say. Pelosi's reaction to Tapper for simply doing his job and not covering Harris only in a positive light is telling. So that's a story over at theblaze.com. I'll leave this and all of the stories links in the show notes over at Gab on my account at BACFA. Betsy McCaughey has this entry this week. Sanctuary city disaster could end under Trump, but will worsen if Harris wins. From New York to Chicago and the Denver suburbs, migrant gangs are mugging, raping, robbing stores, running brothels next to elementary schools, and threatening apartment dwellers with guns in residential buildings, all without fear of being deported. The gangs are turning neighborhoods into hellholes. Blame insane sanctuary laws. The word sanctuary sounds charitable, but don't be fooled. It doesn't mean welcoming the downtrodden, but actually bars police from sharing arrest information with immigration and customs enforcement, so that the agency can take custody of illegal immigrants arrested for violent crimes and deport them. Sanctuary laws, in effect, shield criminals who don't belong in the United States from removal. 11 states and some 600 towns and cities, mostly controlled by Democrats, have them. Because of these laws, migrant lawbreakers go through a revolving door justice system and end up back on the streets to strike again. Americans have a choice. On Saturday, presidential candidate Donald Trump promised to work with Congress to end all sanctuary cities across our country. Or we can choose Vice President Kamala Harris, who has apparently taken a vow of silence on the questions of policy. But her record shows that San Franciscans died because of her stance on migrant crime when she presided as the city's top prosecutor. In 2008, Edwin Ramos, an illegal immigrant from El Salvador, murdered a man and his 2 sons. Prior to the triple murder, Ramos had a history of juvenile arrests for assault and attempted robbery. Had San Francisco police cooperated with federal immigration authorities, Ramos might have been deported instead of free to kill. Similarly, Roni Aguilera, who came to the U.S. illegally from Honduras, murdered Ivan Miranda in 2008. Aguilera had had several earlier run-ins with police, but he remained in San Francisco ready to unleash violence. The media have painted a heroic picture of Harris's career in law enforcement, making claims that she cracked down on violent offenders as San Francisco District Attorney and as California's Attorney General. But the coverage conveniently omits any mention of Ramos, Aguilera, and their victims. As a U.S. Senator, Harris in 2017 voted against a bill that would have increased penalties for criminals who illegally enter after being deported and commit more crimes. The bill went down to defeat. 2 years later, when Harris launched her first campaign for president, she declared that local law enforcement should not act as federal immigration agents in response to an American Civil Liberties Union candidate's questionnaire. As Attorney General, she told the ACLU she had instructed California law enforcement agencies that they did not have to comply with ICE detainers. That is, she encouraged them to ignore federal requests to hold migrant suspects for deportation. These same policies are now causing migrant crime to explode in multiple jurisdictions. 6 Colorado counties being menaced by the Venezuelan prison gang Tren de Aragua are suing to overturn state sanctuary laws that prevent local police from cooperating with ICE to send gang members packing. New York's sanctuary laws have enabled the same gang to set up headquarters in migrant shelters across 5 boroughs and terrorize the public without fear of deportation. Crime victims can thank their own woke politicians. Mayor Adams has called for amending the city's sanctuary laws, but the far-left city council isn't budging. Last week, House Republicans offered a bill to withhold federal aid for migrants from sanctuary jurisdictions. Outrageously, Representative Jerry Nadler, Penguin from Democrat Manhattan, opposed it, claiming it would scapegoat criminal immigrants. That's partisan blather. Police estimate that as many as 75% of those arrested for assault and robbery in Midtown Manhattan, Nadler's district, are recently arrived migrants. On Saturday, Trump pledged to hunt down and capture every single gang member that is being illegally harbored. A tall order, but the place to start is allowing local police to cooperate with ICE. That means sanctuary laws must be overturned nationwide. Trump tried to make that happen by executive order in 2017 when he cut federal funding for sanctuary jurisdictions. But the order was hit with a slew of legal challenges from blue state politicians, and courts including the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that only Congress, not the president, can impose terms on how federal money is spent. If Trump wins in November, he plans to maneuver around those legal roadblocks by asking Congress to pass a law like the one Nadler is railing against. The upcoming elections for president and for House and Senate will determine whether that strategy can succeed. One thing is certain, if Kamala wins, so do the gangs, As borders are, she let them in, and as president, she'll shield them from deportation. Under a Harris presidency, plan to bolt your doors and keep up your guard as you walk around your neighborhood until it's no longer walkable at all. Again, that is Betsy McCaughey over at nypost.com. We have this story. London mayor says the rest of the world is watching the U.S. ahead of the 2024 election. London Mayor Sadiq Khan says that foreign leaders are keeping a careful eye on the U.S. presidential election between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. What I'd say in a respectful way to Americans is, I don't think you realize that the rest of the world is watching because we've got skin in the game, he said on Tuesday in an interview with Politico. Khan, who has had previous disagreements with the former president, likened the United States to a metronome and pointed out how the nation impacts the globe around them. The metaphor I use is, what happens in America is the metronome for the rest of the country, those who play an instrument that sets the beat of what's going to happen across the globe, the mayor said. It sets the beat for how other politicians behave in election campaigns. He continued, claiming that how both campaigns are covered, and particularly whether or not media outlets fact-check both candidates, could easily influence media coverage in other countries. It sets the beat for how and the rhythm and the speed of how journalists report a campaign and how people respond to lies and misinformation, Khan said. And so, everyone's watching across the globe in relation to whether what J.D. Vance and Donald Trump said is fact-checked. Khan also drew attention to the ideological differences between Trump's policies and those of Biden-Harris government, which is vying to retake the White House. While the Trump administration has criticized NATO and embraced a more isolationist foreign policy stance, the current administration has tried to expand American ties throughout the world while encouraging international involvement, a more globalist approach. I would argue, hopefully, objectively, that United Nations, NATO, multilateral agreements with the current president is very different to how it was with the previous president, President Trump, Khan told the outlet. And that's why many of us are watching with keen interest what happens on November 5th in the USA. I'll say that there are vested interests in the outcomes, so much so that we can feel the fingers and the icy cold grasp of some of these vested interests in our very politics every day. Putin lowers threshold of nuclear weapons use in dramatic warning aimed at NATO. This is over at zerohedge.com. At a moment, the West, especially the US and UK, are still mulling whether to allow Ukrainian forces to attack Russian territory using NATO-provided long-range missiles. President Vladimir Putin has just issued a hugely significant statement regarding his country's nuclear doctrine. Putin on Wednesday very clearly lowered the threshold regarding Russian strategic forces' use of nukes. He, in a televised address to Russia's Security Council, said nuclear doctrine has been effectively revised in light of the emergence of new sources of military threats and risks for Russia and our allies. This is clearly in response to the latest series of escalated cross-border attacks from Ukraine deep into Russian territory. Some of these have threatened to hit Moscow. He went on to describe that in the event Western powers assist another nation in a major attack on Russian soil, those same Western powers will be held responsible. This can trigger Russian nuclear launch, according to the new doctrine. This lowers the bar for what can be considered an existential threat against the Russian homeland and its population. Putin laid out, according to a translation, the updated version of the document proposes that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear weapon state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be considered as a joint attack on the Russian Federation. While not stating that this would automatically greenlight the ability of Russia to respond with nuclear weapons, he did assert that the threshold for their use would be met based on reliable information about a massive launch of aerospace attack means and their crossing of our state border. He then included defense of Belarus as being part of the change. We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression against Russia and Belarus as a member of the Union state, Putin said. The below is a paraphrase of Putin's words and some further details of the changes by state-run RT. Moscow would also consider resorting to a nuclear response if it gets reliable information about a massive missile or airstrike launched by another state against Russia or its closest ally, Belarus, according to Putin. The weapons used in an enemy's potential strike could include anything from ballistic or cruise missiles to strategic aircraft and drones, he stated. The timing of this dramatic and serious alteration in nuclear policy is without doubt aimed at Zelensky's visit to the United States, where he is presenting Ukraine's victory plan separately to President Biden, VP Harris, as well as Donald Trump. Zelensky has stressed that a key component of this plan is to have the West lift all restrictions of use of long-range weapons. Ukraine's long-range cross-border attacks have already been somewhat devastating, given dozens of oil and gas depots, airfield, and ammo storage sites have been hit over several months. Zelensky wants to inflict greater pain on Russia directly in hopes at building more leverage for favorable settlement to the war. Biden days ago responded that no, nothing has changed regarding Washington's policy on all this. Putin's Wednesday words are timed to keep up the pressure on the U.S. and to ensure there's no new green light given for Kiev's use of anything like the Army Tactical Missile System or British Storm Shadows. There's a link here to a video over on X. Of course, Putin's prior warning earlier this month should have been enough to dissuade saner minds in the West. He said before that, this would be a significant way change the very nature of the conflict. At the time, he spelled out that long-range missile strikes on Russia would mean that NATO countries, the U.S., European countries, are at war with Russia. Even should Biden resist the drive to escalate further in the face of Putin's fresh nuclear warnings, it remains to be seen what the next administration will do, whoever occupies the White House. In particular, has only been the only candidate to strongly voice that U.S. must prioritize peace negotiations to urgently end the war. Harris is expected to continue Biden's policies, which have resulted in an ongoing escalation slide. Again, this is over at ZeroHedge.com. Union makes shock claim. Colorado meat factory involved in management-led human trafficking of Haitians. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union, the UFCW, has urged federal, state, and local authorities to investigate JBS SA's meat processing plant in Greeley, Colorado, for alleged human trafficking violations involving Haitian migrants. Similar accusations have been made regarding human trafficking networks exploiting migrants at factories in Springfield, Ohio, and Charleroi, Pennsylvania. UFCW Local 7 President Kim Cordova said these Haitians and other foreigners came into the country legally and were quickly exploited for cheap labor in a possible human migrant trafficking scheme. Here are more shocking revelations from the union. Information gathered from UFCW Local 7 members who work at the JBS plant in Greeley, outlined in detail below, includes numerous cases of abusive practices both within and outside of the workplace, including management-led human trafficking utilizing the social media platform TikTok, charging immigrant workers for company-provided rent in squalor conditions, job applications, and transportation. threats and intimidation against workers and their families abroad, dangerously high production line speeds, and withholding mail, including medical bills and important paperwork. There's a link to a tweet from them on X here. The UFCW explained as many as 500 or more Haitian and Benin workers who are in the country legally through work visas or asylum may have been subject to potential crimes and workplace violations. The company knew about these tactics and in fact paid for workers to live in squalor conditions at a local motel and turned a blind eye until they were questioned by the press, said Cordova, adding, one of the main individuals involved in this terrible treatment is still employed by JBS. The union explained that numerous hiring managers outside the company were involved in the scheme. In other words, staffing companies likely served as labor mules, trafficking these migrants from their homes, stuffed in like cattle, to factories in vans. JBS's Greeley plant is located just an hour from the sanctuary city of Denver, run by far-left Democrats. In recent weeks, we informed readers that the story in Springfield, Ohio, and Charleroi, Pennsylvania, was not about claims about Haitians eating cats and dogs, instead about the numerous reports we received claiming labor mules, staffing companies, were exploiting Haitian migrants. And there's a link here to Libs of TikTok with a video. There's additional links to reporting. It says that there's a very real possibility this alleged migrant trafficking network is happening nationwide. And there's a link here to a graphic that shows where the hot spots are. And the largest ones show Cook County in Illinois and Queens in New York. Alleged migrant trafficking networks are becoming an inconvenient truth for Democrats and their globalist allies in the Biden administration, who imported the third world by the millions into the first world. At the end of the day, the blue-collar worker is being replaced. There's a link here from Stephen Miller on X that states Kamala's government works with NGOs who work with local corporations to carry out migrant takeovers of towns. That's how a small hamlet can become a refugee camp overnight. American citizens are dispossessed of the only home they've ever known. Is there a bigger scandal? This was only made possible by globalist, open border policies pushed by the Biden-Harris team. When will the unions wake up to the fact that the Biden-Harris open borders are their demise? The Teamsters already did. Again, that's over at zerohedge.com. The other thing I wanted to mention while this topic is fresh is that this same mechanism is used to leverage labor of those people who are imprisoned. Penitentiaries often outsource labor into fields, and then even on work release or early release, they are made to work in fast food and other places for very below the wages that you would expect from a free individual. We shouldn't have debt slavery in our country. These sorts of practices are going on all the time. If you see it in your neighborhood, you should talk to your local media outlets and get some coverage on it. I have started to see some very strange things in my local area where it seems like let's just say some of the hiring practices seem to be very, very temporary. I want to believe that people can be rehabilitated, and I want to think that people should have another chance at redemption and to get themselves back into the workplace. But it also seems like that mechanism has been turned into a way to leverage them in unhealthy ways and take advantage of them. So, that's what the law is for, is to protect those who aren't able to protect themselves. And that includes those who are coming out of prisons, whether they were in there because they should have been or not.
Is there any other Republican who has your views on this?
Well, I have Republicans who come to me on the floor and say, I wish I could vote with you today. Yours is the right vote, but I would just take too much flack back home. And I have Republicans who come to me and say, that's wrong what AIPAC is doing to you. Let me talk to my AIPAC person. By the way, everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What does that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are, firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has something like this?
I don't know how it works on the Democrat side, but that's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to DC, you go have lunch with them, and they've got your cell number, and you have conversations with them. So I've had
that's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, "I'll talk to my AIPAC person." And it's literally what we call them, my AIPAC guy. I'll talk to my AIPAC guy and see if I can get him to, dial those ads back.
Why have I never heard this before?
It doesn't benefit anybody. Why would they want to tell their constituents that they've basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country? It doesn't benefit the congressman for people to know that, so they're not going to tell you that.
Have you seen any other country do anything like this? Like
no.
Russia obviously determines the outcome of our elections. We keep hearing that. Does anyone have a Putin guy that they talk to?
Not only do they not have a Putin guy, look, they don't have a Britain guy. They don't have an Australian guy. They don't have a Germany dude. It's the only country that does this, that has somebody that uniformly. I guarantee there's some spreadsheet at AIPAC where the AIPAC dude who's matched up with the congressman is there, and then all the congressman's votes on the issue.
Over a quarter of U.S. judges not enrolled in home security program, report says. I wonder about these kinds of reports, because is this something we really want to tell people, that there are some vulnerable judges who might be accessible to crazies in this season? Maybe this isn't such a good thing to report. About 28% of federal judges do not participate in a program run by the U.S. Marshals Service that provides electronic security systems to detect home intrusions, despite a growing number of threats to the judiciary, according to a report by the U.S. Department of Justice's Inspector General on Tuesday. I mean, we know what happened to old Nancy Pelosi and her husband, with the hammer guy, right? The report by the Justice Department's internal watchdog found that participation among judges had increased since an earlier audit in 2021, when only 60% were enrolled in the electronic security system program. But it said that the Marshals Service was unaware of why judges were not participating in the program, and the agency had only recently sought to obtain data to understand the phenomena through a survey of judges completed in April. The Marshals Service, which is responsible for the protection of 2,700 federal judges, along with other court personnel, and the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, did not respond to requests for comment. But in a July 24th letter responding to a draft of the report, the Marshals Service said it is working on ways to incorporate input from judges in order to address any major or recurring issues that are identified. The report comes amid a rising number of threats to judges nationally, as documented in a Reuters investigation. Serious threats against federal judges rose to 457 in fiscal year 2023, which ended on September 30th, from 224 in fiscal 2021. Efforts to bolster protection for federal judges gained steam after 2020, when a disgruntled lawyer posing as a deliveryman in July 2020 shot and killed the 20-year-old son of U.S. District Judge Esther Salas at her New Jersey home. A California man, Nicholas Rosk, is awaiting trial after being charged in 2022 with attempting to assassinate conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh following his arrest near the justice's home. The home security system has existed since 2005. The voluntary program provides participating judges intrusion detection equipment, maintenance, and monitoring services for their residences. But a 2021 Inspector General report found the program offers limited or outdated equipment options to its users, which could dissuade judges from opting into the program or force them to choose an alternative security system. The Marshals Service restructured the Home Intrusion Detection System HIDS program in 2022 following that earlier report, and the Justice Department's Office of the Inspector General on Tuesday said participation subsequently rose 13%. But the report faulted the agency for not conducting a survey of judges for their input on the home security program before it undertook the 2022 restructuring, as the 2021 audit had already recommended. We believe seeking this input and taking other steps, such as identifying judges' unique home security needs, identifying and removing impediments to judges' HIDS participation, and providing more training to USMS personnel could help improve the HIDS program, the report said. There's more links here at Reuters.com. This story, Telegram will now hand over IP addresses, phone numbers of suspects to cops. And of course, my immediate thought is, well, what's a suspect? Who qualifies as a suspect? The subheading here is maybe a spell in a French cell changed Durov's mind. In a volte-face, Telegram CEO Pavel Durov announced that the Made in Russia messaging platform will become a lot less cozy for criminals. We've had updated our terms of service and privacy policy, ensuring they are consistent across the world, Durov said. We've made it clear that the IP addresses and phone numbers of those who violate our rules can be disclosed to relevant authorities in response to valid legal requests. A glance at current and past terms and conditions for the service, which offers private and public instant messaging, finds that the original fine print reads, if Telegram receives a court order that confirms you're a terror suspect, we may disclose your IP address and phone number to the relevant authorities. So far, this has never happened. This is now changed to, if Telegram receives a valid order from the relevant judicial authorities that confirms you're a suspect in a case involving criminal activities that violate the Telegram terms of service, we will perform a legal analysis of the request and may disclose your IP address and phone number to the relevant authorities. As you can see, a shift from cooperating with terror investigations to criminal probes in general. This is fairly significant as Telegram pretty much billed itself as a haven for those avoiding government surveillance and investigations. It offers a degree of end-to-end encryption for its users, more on that below, and organized its IT infrastructure around the world to effectively resist handing over information about its users to the authorities, which made it a destination for all kinds of netizens, good and bad. We have disclosed 0 bytes of user data to third parties, including governments, as the Biz would put in its documentation. Proton Mail, another internet service that promotes itself as highly private, updated its terms and services in 2021 after it handed over a suspect's IP address and other info to cops upon request, which led to the arrest of a French climate activist. Durov also described how the business was attempting to clean up Telegram-hosted content that was discoverable via its search function. Think people having conversations about and sharing media of highly illegal stuff that others can find and join. Over the last few weeks, a team of moderators, supported by AI tools, of course, has been going through posts to find and block scumbags up to no good, Durov said, and he urged people to report illegal behavior on the service. The phrase last few weeks could be telling here. In August, Durov was arrested in France after landing at Le Bourget Airport. The multi-billionaire was held for days in jail before being charged with failure to cooperate with French law enforcement and allowing the use of his platform to facilitate trading in drugs and child sex abuse material, online harassment, and other crimes. Durov, who co-founded the Russian social network VK with his brother, the pair left the service in 2014 to set up Telegram, was released on bail of 5 million euros, and he is not allowed to leave the country until the charges are settled one way or another. And a week after his arrest, the South Korean government's telecom regulators approached the French for advice in dealing with the flood of deepfake porn that has become epidemic in the Asian country, and Telegram promptly apologized and began to curb that very content on its network. Telegram, an LLC registered in the British Virgin Islands, does allow for end-to-end encryption, but only in so-called secret chat messages, not by default, and these can only be opened on specific devices. The story again is over at theregister.com. This week, Israel's pager attacks and supply chain vulnerabilities. Israel's brazen attacks on Hezbollah last week, in which hundreds of pagers and two-way radios exploded and killed at least 37 people, graphically illustrated a threat that cybersecurity experts have been warning about for years. Our international supply chains for computerized equipment leave us vulnerable, and we have no good means to defend ourselves. Though the deadly operations were stunning, none of the elements used to carry them out were particularly new. Tactics employed by Israel, which has neither confirmed nor denied any role to hijack an international supply chain and embed plastic explosives in Hezbollah devices, have been used for years. What's new is that Israel put them together in such a devastating and extravagantly public fashion, bringing into stark relief what the future of great power competition will look like in peacetime, wartime, and the ever-expanding gray zone in between. The targets won't be just terrorists. Our computers are vulnerable, and increasingly so are our cars, our refrigerators, our home thermostats, and many other useful things in our orbits. Targets are everywhere. The core component of the operation, implanting plastic explosives in pagers and radios, has been a terrorist risk since Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber, tried to ignite some on an airplane in 2001. That's what all of those airport scanners are designed to detect, both the ones you see at security checkpoints and the ones that later scan your luggage. Even a small amount can do an impressive degree of damage. The second component, assassination by personal device, isn't new either. Israel used this tactic against a Hamas bomb maker in 1996 and a Fatah activist in 2000. Both were killed by remotely detonated booby-trapped cell phones. The final and more logistically complex piece of Israel's plan, attacking an international supply chain to compromise equipment at scale, is something that the United States has done, though for different purposes. The National Security Agency has intercepted communications equipment in transit and modified it not for destructive purposes but for eavesdropping. We know from an Edward Snowden document that the agency did this to a Cisco router destined for a Syrian telecommunications company. Presumably this wasn't the agency's only operation of this type. Creating a front company to fool victims isn't even a new twist. Israel reportedly created a shell company to produce and sell explosive-laden devices to Hezbollah. In 2019, the FBI created a company that sold supposedly secure cell phones to criminals, not to assassinate them, but to eavesdrop on and then arrest them. The bottom line, our supply chains are vulnerable, which means that we are vulnerable. Any individual, country, or group that interacts with a high-tech company chain can subvert the equipment passing through it. It can be subverted to eavesdrop. It can be subverted to degrade or fail on command. And although it's harder, it can be subverted to kill. Personal devices connected to the internet and countries where they are in high use, such as the United States, are especially at risk. In 2007, the Idaho National Laboratory demonstrated that a cyber attack could cause a high-voltage generator to explode. In 2010, a computer virus believed to have been developed by the United States and Israel destroyed centrifuges at an Iranian nuclear facility. In 2017, dump of CIA documents included statements about the possibility of remotely hacking cars, which WikiLeaks asserted could be used to carry out nearly undetectable assassinations. This isn't just theoretical. In 2015, a Wired reporter allowed hackers to remotely take over his car while he was driving it. They disabled the engine while he was on a highway. The world has already begun to adjust to this threat. Many countries are increasingly wary of buying communications equipment from countries they don't trust. The United States and others are banning large routers from the Chinese company Huawei because we fear they could be used for eavesdropping and, even worse, disabled remotely in a time of escalating hostilities. In 2019, there was a minor panic over Chinese-made subway cars that could have been modified to eavesdrop on their riders. It's not just finished equipment that's under the scanner. More than a decade ago, the U.S. military investigated the security risks of using Chinese parts in its equipment. In 2018, a Bloomberg report revealed U.S. investigators had accused China of modifying computer chips to steal information. It's not obvious how to defend against these and similar attacks. Our high-tech supply chains are complex and international. It didn't raise any red flags to Hezbollah that the group's pagers came from a Hungary-based company that sourced them from Taiwan, because that sort of thing is perfectly normal. Most of the electronics Americans buy come from overseas, including our iPhones, whose parts come from dozens of countries before being pieced together primarily in China. That's a hard problem to fix. We can't imagine Washington passing a law requiring iPhones to be made entirely in the United States. Labor costs are too high, and our country doesn't have the domestic capacity to make these things. Our supply chains are deeply, inexorably international, and changing that would require bringing global economies back to the 1980s. So what happens now? As for Hezbollah, its leaders and operatives will no longer be able to trust equipment connected to a network, very likely one of the primary goals of the attacks. And the world will have to wait to see if there are any long-term effects of this attack and how the group will respond. But now that the line has been crossed, other countries will almost certainly start to consider this sort of tactic as within bounds. It could be deployed against a military during a war or against civilians in the run-up to the war. And developed countries like the United States will be especially vulnerable simply because of the sheer number of vulnerable devices we have. Again, this is Schneier on security at Schneier.com. For those of you who listen to Sunday Long Live and Rehoboth in the first hour on WBN 324.zil on Sundays, you would know what the real value of ledgers can be in the crypto world and how the International Bank of Settlements is managing that for everybody, and how that's really more important than the denomination. You'd also know what the real threat is for BRICS currency against the reserve currency and where that reserve currency is and whether or not it's in the United States. I would encourage you to check it out. Go to WBN324.zil and look for the Linktree link. You can find all the places that recordings live for Sunday Long Live Radio. I'm happy to be a part of that show. BBC.com has this story: Crypto world hoping for Trump election win. The cryptocurrency industry is rife with fraud and hucksters and grifters, one of the United States' top financial regulators has told the BBC. The chair of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, Gary Gensler, says the investing public around the globe has lost too much money because of crypto companies not following the laws his agency tries to enforce. It comes as the industry is spending millions of dollars on political donations, trying to influence the outcome of November's U.S. elections in the hope of more favorable future laws. In addition to the presidential battle between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, all 435 districts in the House of Representatives are up for re-election, as well as 33 of the 100 seats in the Senate. The future of cryptocurrency, one of the world's most hotly debated technologies, is an issue where there appears to be a clear dividing line between Donald Trump and the outgoing Biden administration. Trump has been courting the votes of crypto enthusiasts by promising to make America the crypto capital of the planet and creating a strategic national Bitcoin stockpile, similar to the United States government's gold reserves. Last week, he launched a new crypto business called World Liberty Financial, and although he provided few details, he said, "I think crypto is one of those things we have to do." It's a huge turnaround from 3 years ago when he dismissed Bitcoin as something that seems like a scam and a threat to the US dollar. Trump's newfound enthusiasm is a stark contrast to the Biden administration, of which Harris is the vice president. The White House has led a sweeping crackdown on crypto firms in recent years. In March, Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder and boss of FTX, was jailed for 25 years for fraud after he stole billions of dollars from customers around the world, many of whom are still trying to recover their money. Then in April, the founder of the world's biggest crypto exchange, Binance's Changpeng Zhao, got 4 months in prison, and the company paid 4.3 billion US dollars, that's 3.2 billion pounds fine. He admitted to allowing criminals, child abusers, and terrorists to launder money on his platform in a case brought by the U.S. Justice Department. The SEC also has a case against Binance going through the courts. It's one of a record high 46 enforcement actions the financial regulator took last year against firms trying to profit from what is still an emerging technology. This is a field that has come along, and just because they're recording their crypto assets on a new accounting ledger, they wrongly say, "We don't think we want to comply with the time-tested laws," says Mr. Gensler. He explains that the rules that force companies that want to raise money from the public to share certain information with them have been in place to protect investors since the SEC was created. This was back in 1934. In the aftermath of the infamous Wall Street crash of 1929 that heralded the Great Depression. Crypto is just a small piece of the U.S. and worldwide capital markets, but it can undermine trust that everyday investors have in the capital markets, says Mr. Gensler. Whilst fans argue that crypto offers a cheap, fast, and secure way to move funds, a survey by the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, found that the number of Americans using it has dropped from 12% in 2021 to 7% last year. Harris hasn't said much about cryptocurrencies, but one of her advisors did say last month that she would support policies that ensure that emerging technologies and that sort of industry can continue to grow. Recent meetings between her team and industry executives have been trying to build trust and given crypto bosses hope of a brighter future, whoever wins in November. I can't underscore enough how important this is, not just for the U.S., but for the world, according to Paul Grewal, who is Chief Legal Officer at crypto firm Coinbase. He's been at the meetings. Not only is the U.S. an important market for crypto, but so much of the important technology surrounding has been developed here, and I think it's also critically important that we not lose sight of the fact that the rest of the world is not simply waiting for the U.S. to get its act together. He adds that given how tight the race for the White House is, every vote is going to count, and crypto votes are no exception. The clampdown on cryptocurrencies in the U.S. this year has been mirrored in Europe. In April, the European Union agreed new laws to try to reduce the risk of crypto being used by criminals. However, other regulators are being slower to act. The G20 group of leading economies is working on minimum standards for cryptocurrencies, but they're not legally binding, and uptake has been slow. Back in the U.S., a bill to regulate cryptocurrencies has been passed by the House, but not the Senate. Its critics argue it will give less protection to consumers. Coinbase's Mr. Grewal backs the bill and says this isn't an industry that's shying away from regulation. He adds that the sector just wants the same standards applied to crypto as are applied to other assets. No tougher, but no weaker. With November's U.S. elections on the horizon, the crypto industry has sensed an opportunity to help elect lawmakers who take a sympathetic view of their businesses. By last month, the sector had already spent an unprecedented $119 million on donations, according to research by the nonprofit Public Citizen. The consumer advocacy organization's research director, Rick Claypool, says the money is being used to help elect pro-crypto candidates and attack crypto critics. This is regardless of political affiliation. They've spent more than any other industry when it comes to corporate donations because they are attempting to discipline the U.S. Congress to give in to their demands for less oversight and to weaken protections for consumers, he adds. This is again over at bbc.com. TechCrunch has this story. Zuckerberg chats with AI clone as human creator looks on in Gear's weirdest demo. AI has already given us some weird demos, and friends, it's only going to get weirder from here. As the tech world runs screaming headfirst into the uncanny valley, lines will blur and everything will continue getting stranger. Take, for example, Wednesday's Meta Connect keynote. There was a constant drumbeat of Meta AI and Llama demos during the event, but one in particular stood out for its strangeness. Mark Zuckerberg invited creator Don Allen Stevenson III to join him on stage. The Meta CEO proceeded to pick up a phone and carry on a conversation with an AI-generated version of Stevenson, as the genuine article stood between the executive and an image of himself on the big screen. The demo showcased AI Studio, a platform for designing custom chatbots. The program, which rolled out to all U.S. creators in July, started with text only. Wednesday's event, meanwhile, showcased how creators can essentially create virtual versions of themselves. If you're getting a ton of DMs and you're missing the time to respond, Creator AI for me has been answering a lot of my frequently asked questions, Stevenson said of how he's used the platform. It saves time. I have time to go outside, take a break. Meta ran the demo at the same presentation that gave us chatbots voiced by Aquafina, Dame Judi Dench, John Cena, Keegan-Michael Key, and Kristen Bell. It only gets weirder from here. Now, I think that what we'll see, as we've seen all along, is as this technology progresses, there will be greater exposure of things that you just can't believe your eyes. Let's take, for instance, Diddy. Are there video calls? Is there evidence? And then can defense people put up the argument, oh, this is generated, this is artificial, this is fiction, you can't believe what you see. None of this evidence is really real. And then how can that be extrapolated to other types of crimes, human trafficking, or in political circles? And how can it be used to create stuff that isn't real? We've seen it already in this cycle. We've seen pictures of Hillary Clinton making statements that are obviously false. We've seen it using Keir Starmer's voice. We can see it using any kind of profiled voice, even people who are long dead. And so to resurrect those voices and to make people listen and maybe not clarify that, hey, this is a gag, can be treated as a problem. I don't know if you remember the guy who got arrested for doing a meme that was a joke about what day to vote. Hey, Democrats, vote on November 2nd. Everybody else go to the polls on November 3rd. I mean, whatever, right? They threw the book at him because it's election interference. So even jokes are now falling into this category of disinformation. It doesn't even have to be as sophisticated as an artificial person. We'll just have to keep our eyes open and ask good questions about how can we know what is true. Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Atomic Biscuits. I really appreciate you dropping by. It's a stormy weekend here in the southeast while we watch Hurricane Helene crawl ashore and swamp everything. And I hope that the weather is nicer where you are, that you'll have the time to spend this autumn with your friends and family as we move into the holiday season. Don't forget, like you could, that we need to keep our head on a swivel as things get stranger and stranger. Have a great week, everybody. See you on the next episode of Atomic Biscuits.
Thanks for joining us for Atomic Biscuits. Tune in again next week for more news and music. Check out BACFA on Gab at BACFA, as well as BitChute, Rumble, D-Live and Odyssey. Check out LastScoutRadio.com for fun content. Listen to WBN 324 on radio stations around the world, on many streaming platforms, and World Broadcasting Network WBN 324.zil.